the other thing I wanted to ask about as well was, so I was mentioning I've seen videos of people doing very impressive feats, and things where, for example, they'll balance a tatami mat on top to make like a T shape, and maybe cut the. I think you've done this recently, haven't you? You cut each arm off, and
and then you cut down the middle.
So those are essentially just cutting feats, aren't they? They're to show control and speed and.
It's a Japanese cut called cutting the wings off a dragonfly. I don't know the Japanese word for it anymore. It's less to show because they're not very show-offy. You see stuff on television with music, that's not really them. That's like a derivative of it.
Right.
Koreans are very showy.
Yeah.
At least, or maybe it's the same thing is true for them because you see a lot more of that.
I like the Korean ones because they spin around and do flips and stuff.
But there's probably a Korean sword right now going, no, we're not. Those are the bad people. Fine, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. So what they do, the reason for that is so your first cut, right? Because it's balanced on the T. If your first cut isn't totally clean, okay, it's going to fall off, right? So to show that you can deliver a cut that's completely perfect, and then do it again, right? And if you can do it twice, then you get the satisfaction of chopping the thing that's still there. And of course that shows precise aim because usually it's about that wide at that point.
And another one you see is where they cut low on the mat and then cut through the rest of the map as it's mat as it's falling, and things like that. The last thing I would like to ask about is how have you changed or adapted the traditional cutting methods or formats for HEMA? What have you changed? Because I know that you've brought in some interesting things with poles and stuff. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, we have the whole back edge issue, right? Yeah. So we have all kinds of cuts that they...
Two edges with a longsword, unless it's a messer.
So we have to adapt for that. So there's all kinds of cuts that we have that don't exist in Japanese schools or competitions.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the Japanese are incredibly perfection driven, right?
Yeah.
So a proper, a reputable Japanese school is going to start you off with very basic things, right? And it's not going to let you do advanced things until you have perfected those basic things.
Until you're about 60 years old.
No, it's not that long. They're not that bad. If they're that bad, it's probably because the teacher himself is not good. He doesn't want to see you surpass. It's really up to you how fast you grow. But so that had to go, right? Because HEMA people are not. You teach someone to cut, right? And they just barely get the one Oberhau, the right Oberhau that everybody gets, and then they're like, "No, I want to try his Zwerchau," and you're like, "Dude, you just learned like 2 minutes ago. Give it a rest." So in these tournaments that I've created, I just challenge people. Right? I just create these weird things that I don't even know if people will be able to do, like the triple to Tommies Zwerch. I had no idea that anyone was going to do that.
Yeah. So this happened last night at the final of the cutting competition for third place.
We had a tie for third and fourth.
Yeah. And it was James?
James Clark and Tim Hall were tied for third place.
Yeah. So James Clark did. So Mike set the challenge that you had to do 2 Zwerchhaus. So for those who don't know, it's a sort of twisting cut like that with
your hilt up, and so it's very hard to control the edge alignment up here with the grip.
It's really difficult, and of course it comes in quite horizontally. And generally, horizontal cuts are harder on tatamis than upwards or downwards because you don't have an angle.
Right. It's not stabilized the way it is on the
mat. So it has a tendency to try and knock the mat over. And so the challenge was you had to do or try and do two Zwerchhaus from each side. And he did 2 brilliantly, and then did a third, like a bonus. And I think everyone was. I think that was probably the highlight actually of the cutting, wasn't it? It was pretty amazing. So essentially you've looked at the European longsword, mostly German longsword, it has to be said, traditions, and brought in those cuts into tatami cutting. And what's the thing with the poles? You had something with two plastic poles.
Yeah, that's called a short stroke cut. So the way you learn, and I learned this from Japanese arts, and I see no reason why it wouldn't be true in Europe. You start out with a very large arc, and then you start to realize that your power stroke, which you think is this, is actually not that. It's actually much smaller because you peak out, right, and then you just continue like terminal velocity.
The same velocity,
So then you always want to try to. Sang Sensei says, "Learn big, make small." Okay? Even though he speaks perfect English, he still does that because he adopts mannerisms from his teacher, which all good teachers do, I think. you learn this big, huge arc, and then you learn how to minimize it, right? So essentially, eventually you have this tiny little, and a lot of people don't like, they say, well, you need rotation in your cuts, or you need that. I mean, most people certainly need rotation in their cuts. Some people can just go, and your arm's like, hey, where'd that go? Oh, it's burning blood, right?
If you can do the same result with less movement, then of course do the same result with less movement.
The tactical advantages are obvious, right? So the poles, it's a feat, right? So they have to start within one pole and finish without hitting the other one too hard. Ideally without hitting it at all.
So you start with you've got two poles either side of the mat, and the mat stands in the middle, and you start with your blade touching one pole, and you've got to cut through the mat, but then stop the blade without damaging the other pole, as it were, or before touching it, preferably.
Preferably. You get bonus if you don't touch the pole.
Cool. So essentially it's a bit like the 1-inch punch, isn't it? It's essentially showing that you can go from point zero to accelerate to stop and perform a good cut in the middle. I think it's really challenging.
Exactly the same concept.
So last bonus question before we wrap up. Katana, longsword, which is better?
Honestly, they're very similar. It's always a sword. They each have advantages and disadvantages, right? The longsword is longer.
Yeah.
Right. That could also be a disadvantage because a katana might be faster in some people's hands.
Maybe in close. Yeah.
That too. When you're closer up, it's a disadvantage. However, the advantage and disadvantage washes, right?
Yeah.
So that makes them even. Now you have the cross guard on the longsword, which is great, right? On the katana you have the tsuba, right? And later on you had rings. So the katana gives you more protection over here, for example, and less protection here. However, the katana has curvature.
Yeah.
So if you know how to use curvature, you know when you're in Longanort, right, and someone cuts at your forearm, and you just go like that, right, to parry it or like that, it'll go straight down the blade, and if you don't do it right, it'll hit you here. If the blade were curved, what would happen is if it hit before the curve, it would come off the blade, right?
Right.
So the thing there is you need to know how to use it, but once you know how to use it, you don't need the cross guard for that.
So would you argue that, because I've been asked by a lot of viewers in the past why Chinese and Japanese and Korean swords have circular guards on them, do you think it might be connected to the curved blades?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those mysteries, like why did, certain cultures in the Far East had circular guards and pretty much everybody else either had no guard or some kind of cross guard.
Now that you mention it, it probably is because they figured they didn't need it. Because once you learn how to use the curvature, then those kind of deflections...
I mean, some people have suggested, and I think they're wrong, that it's because they don't have much blade contact. But I disagree with that, because in Kenjutsu, just look up any good Kenjutsu video on YouTube and you can see they have tons of blade contact. Edge on edge, edge on flat, edge on back, all of the different blade contacts you can think of, they're all there, even half swording.
Even winding, although technically not winding, because winding is the rotating motion, and so they will change leverage positions or without that rotation sometimes. I don't think I've seen it with the rotation. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist because I haven't seen everything, but the techniques are essentially the same.
In the question of longsword versus katana, would you say that on average katanas cut better than longswords?
Some things. Then the biggest reason they cut some things better is because they're stiffer, right? Yeah. So when a longsword is longer, thinner in some ways, and it's more vibrating, is that a word?
Yeah, more wobbly.
More wobbly, yeah. So when you strike something, even if you don't see it, there's vibrations, right? Yeah. And those vibrations not only rob you of some power, but they create friction and the thing as it cuts and all that. And the katana has less of that.
Yeah, it's a very stiff blade, and definitely stiffer blades are easier to cut with. What I've personally felt, and I've never had top-end replica katanas, and I've never had an original katana, but what I've found cutting with replica katanas and replica longswords, and giving them to my friends to cut with, is that katanas are very forgiving, and part of that is the stiffness. And because of the edge geometry and the stiffness, even if you get the cut slightly wrong, they often drag their way through the target, whereas a longsword is more liable to twist and bounce and this kind of stuff, partly because of the flex, partly because of the edge geometry, various things like that. And sort of connected to this, I noticed there are certain models of Albion longsword that are now becoming quite popular in cutting competitions, and they are broad and thin, aren't they? Presumably they cut better.
What that gives them is, so thinner is better because there's less resistance.
Less friction.
Yeah, less friction. And broader makes them stiffer.
And easier to keep the edge aligned.
Maybe.
I think so.
If you think so, then it's true for you. That's how that works.
Well, actually, I'm not the only one. There was a guy called Colonel Mary Mong in the 19th century, writing in about 1840, who says that broader blades like a weather vane, they straighten themselves through the air.
Oh, because of air resistance.
Yeah.
I never thought of that.
So a broader blade actually, like the tail on an airplane, will pull the blade straight as it goes through the air.
There's probably something to that.
It makes sense.
It does. It does.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a good point to finish on. But there's loads of content in the video. I hope it's been appreciated. Thank you very much to Mike. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.